Have you ever wanted to take the time to go around and paint up a few models, perhaps even a unit, but equally you know that you need to paint them quickly so that you can get ready for a game that's imminently approaching? Well, we're going to be covering that today. We're going over a staged method of painting, which allows us to quickly get the models to a very simple level suitable for initial gameplay, and then we can get the best of both worlds, push the painting a little bit further when we have the time later on, and then keep using them for gaming when they look even better. This is, as I say, a staged process, and we're going to be kicking it off with levels, and we are naturally starting with level 1. Level 1 is all about getting bulk colours down, and to achieve this we can do it relatively quickly with contrast. If you have a scheme that you're following, naturally this is going to be nice and easy. Otherwise, what you want to do is just work around and pick out all of the various elements in various colours. For example, here we are doing red armour and red carapace. If we move beyond that, what we can then do is pick out minor details. These are going to be things like your belts and your straps, and we're going to be doing this in a dark black. While they other minor elements, we're looking at things like trousers, robes, skirts. These are going to get a nice dark brown contrast. Naturally, we still have the skin to paint at this point, and for this what we're going to be doing is grabbing a black-blue contrast and then applying this all over the skin instead of using the dark black contrast from earlier. Now, you might be asking, Ben, why are we using two different black contrasts? We've got a Black Legion and we've got a Black Templar. Why don't we just use one for all of the various black elements? And there is a genuine reason. Obviously, these are different colours. Black Legion is quite a deep, rich, dark black, whereas Black Templar is more of a very dark black navy, and it also doesn't cover in exactly the same way. We get more of that undercoat showing through. So with that in mind, we get a little bit of variation on the two different black areas, and they don't just look densely black next to each other, which gives us a nice little bit of separation and variation on the model. With the blacks and the skins and everything like that sorted, there are some elements on here that we've got left to do. We've got things like the mutations and the guns. Those mutations naturally come with claws, and that's what we're tackling next. We want these claws to come across as a relatively bluish grey, similar to the High Fleet artwork that we are basing this cult on. And this is where we're going to want to move away from contrast. We first want to mix up a combination of a turquoise and a light grey. This bright mix will only be used to base coat, as once it's dry, what we want to do is add a little more grey into the previous mix, giving us a lighter, more desaturated turquoise. As a broad highlight, what we're going to do is work around and pick out all of the upward facing edges and all of the top surfaces. This sets us up really nicely for the next step to finish off the weapons by taking the black that we used on the skin in the form of Black Templar and mixing this in with 50% contrast medium. This thinned contrast can then be applied over all of the areas that we've painted with this bluish grey. Similar to how you would expect, this thinned contrast goes over really nicely and pulls and settles in the recesses as well as some of the downward facing flat panels. Because of the medium that we've added to the contrast, it also doesn't tint the edges as much, giving us a really nice brightish blue-grey shiny edge to our claws. But obviously these models don't just have claws, teeth and raptorial limbs. What we need to do is paint up their guns, and we're going to be doing that, kicking it off with a brown contrast, which we can do at the same time as painting our robes. As mentioned, the guns are being kicked off with a brown contrast, and this is the same contrast we used on the robes, so we might as well do it at the same time. But once this is dry, what we want to do is grab a metallic, and this metal is going to be a relatively silvery gold. This is a really shiny paint that can then be overbrushed across all of the metal areas. This is very similar to dry brushing, but we'll be keeping a fair amount of wet paint in the brush, which will then come off easily, picking out all of the flat and raised surfaces. This can be relatively heavy-handed, so to reduce some of the coverage on sculpted details, what we're going to do is add some aging and some shading by taking a blue-green wash and using this over all of the metal areas we've painted. For the most part, this is level 1 sorted. This means that we can stick them on a base, we can go out and have a game with them. We can see if we like the unit, if we want to use them in an army, if that's the reason that we're painting them. And if not, and we want to paint them at any time, we just need to take them back to the painting desk and we can start to push these boys up to level 2. Level 2 is where we are going to push most of the elements up a little bit. We're going to be starting off with the armor. We are going to want to grab a red, and this red needs to be slightly brighter than the brightest section of the red contrast base coat. We want to take this carefully chosen red and then carefully work around picking out all of the edges and upward facing panels. This will include all of the edges on the downward facing areas. On this model we have areas like the stomach. We want to make sure we catch all of those. Once all of those elements have been nicely picked out with our initial red and we've got a nice defined area, we want to grab a slightly brighter red and then essentially go round and repeat the process. However, this time we are going to be applying a slightly thinner and more directional highlight, focusing more on the areas that are top down that the light would hit the most. While we're going around and painting up the armor, there are some of these models that actually have Tyranid carapace on their limbs, and we are painting the scheme up so that the armor is essentially replicating the carapace. So they're both going to be red, but we're going to want them to be slightly different. But at this stage, we can paint them both up to this level, going through the red contrast and the two highlights that we've done so far. But we will be splitting this off a little bit later on and trying to build out some different textures and looks on those two elements. So we can jump back to painting the rest of the red armor as soon as you've subscribed. With all of that subscription confetti falling to the floor of your YouTube page, we can grab a bright, bold red. And we want to use this to carefully apply another round of highlights, picking out the sharpest and the brightest points. We want to carefully aim for the center of armor ridges and areas that light would hit the most. This then lets us move across to the actual Tyranid carapace elements. Here what we're going to be doing is grabbing a strong bright orange and then mixing this into our initial first layer red paint that we used earlier. This will give us an orangey yellow hue to our red, and we can use this to apply a subtle edge highlight to all of our carapace panels. Doing this will give us a really nice subtle change on the carapace and the actual armor panels that we have painted up. Obviously, if you want to go a little bit further, if you want to be a little bit more adventurous, you can go to a brighter shade of orange. Just make sure that you're not painting so much orange that your carapace now looks orange instead of red. That's the primary key. We want it to look red. Talking about variation, the next step that we're going on to is going to be painting up things like the robes, basically all of the fabrics that we painted brown earlier, and we're going to be needing to paint them in a couple of different directions as well, mainly because there's a lot of those fabrics laying next to each other and we need a little bit of separation. So we can achieve that really nice and really simply, but first we're going to have to get to the same point similar to we did with the reds. So we're going to be taking our brown contrast and mixing in a little bit of a medium brown. We can take this lighter brown mix and apply it liberally across all of the various brown fabric elements, building out an overall brightness across the areas, but leaving the recesses with our initial brown contrast. Once we have hit any of the brown straps, robes and flags, we can start to pivot. For this, we can vary between option 1 and option 2, and we're going to be doing that across the brown elements. For elements painted as option 1, what we want to do is mix our medium brown into equals amount of an ochre tone. This can then be applied, building up the passes of highlights slowly until we get a brighter tone. We opted to paint the robes and the trousers in this option. Clearly, this will break down and isolate out this area, meaning that we can finish off option 1 with a final thin application of a pure thin yellow ochre. This will mainly be picking out the sharpest points on areas like folds and creases. Whereas for all of the other elements that are being painted in option 2, we are going to be following the same stages. But on the first stage, rather than going in with an ochre, we are going to mix an orange brown in and use this for our first round of highlights. Then, as before, what we can do is thin down the pure orange that we used in this mix, and then use this to pick out the brightest areas on all of the fabrics we've painted as option 2. This will hopefully give us a really nice spread of browns across the model, giving us some good variation and separation on all of those elements, which I think is quite important here because there are a lot of models that are wearing brown trousers and then have a cloth as well, and that would all kind of blend into one color if we painted it as one color. So by doing this, we've got two colors. Naturally, we could have added in a third hue, used a different highlight color and painted 3 different fabrics. And because we've all used the same source point and then built out from there, we can be relatively confident that they're going to look nice together. But with all the browns done, we need to jump to something more fun, which is going to be finishing off shining up and making those claws look amazing. We are going to be kicking off the claws with a mix, and we want this mix to be our turquoise and grey from earlier that we used for the base coat back in level 1. But what we want to do is mix in more grey than we did initially, giving us a slightly tinted grey that is more grey than turquoise. This can then be used to edge highlight every single edge on all of the claws and weapons that we are painting in this bluish grey. This will also include some of the largest upward facing sections, things like the back of the talons that are facing directly up. Once we've gone round, picked out these details and they're all dry, what we can then do is take our silver grey from the mix, dilute this slightly and use it in a pure application. What we want to do is apply it to the tips of all of the edges on things like the claws and the weapons, as well as the centre of any panels that we hit with the last highlight. This will hopefully bring the claws to a really nice grey blue that almost looks like it shines. Now this really only leaves two main areas, but before we get there I just want to check, just in case my very subtle message earlier didn't get noticed. Just can you check if you've subscribed and also like the video, because it really does help us out, and if you've made it this far I think you're enjoying yourself. With that all said, I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's go to the blacks, which is in the form of the belts and the pouches, as well as the skin. We will be starting with the leathers, and this is a nice simple process. We're doing a one pass highlight using a dark grey green tone. We want to work around and quickly apply an edge highlight to all of the areas, even though we know that most of these areas won't even be looked at. That gives us time to focus on the skin instead, which we will be highlighting with a mix between a decayed flesh and our black-blue contrast that we used for the base. We want to make up this mix and apply it to most, or if not all, of the edges as we work around the body, applying it to all of the appendages. But as we work away from the central body and we get to the end of limbs or the edge of a head, we want to broaden the highlights, which means that we will end up with more of the flesh tone further away from the body, in keeping with the current scheme of this army. To be honest, that's pretty much level 2 done. You will notice there are a couple of elements that we actually didn't touch on this model. Mainly, we're looking at things like the lights that are on the uniform, and there's a couple of reasons why we haven't painted those. One, it's a very small area that, to be honest, unless you're looking at these photos, you probably wouldn't notice that it wasn't painted anyway. The other reason is that there's actually kind of a level 3 and possibly even a level 4 to this painting technique of layering up and building stages at points that you can stop and then continue. And that's part of the lighting is in the next stage. So that's why we haven't done it here, because if I do that video of what I would do on level 3 for these models, I will need those lights basically blank, and I'd have to repaint them if I painted them now. With that all said, I am aware that the hobby doesn't fit nicely into little boxes, level 1, stage 1, process 1, process 2. Yes, there are painting ways and things of doing that we know does work in stages. Obviously, you can't, well, you can do your highlight before you do your shading and your wet blending and things like that. But generally, there are layers and stages and processes. But you can kind of mix and match how you do them. But I think this does a nice way of showing that you can, if you want to work in that segmented, let's do this, get playing, and then paint the model from there on, that is achievable. However, if you don't like this scheme and you want to see a Genestealer cult in a different color scheme, why not check out this video, where we paint up a Genestealer cult Saboteur in a more box art style color scheme using the Atom range of paints. If you don't have time for that, however, don't worry, because what you can do is to make sure that you've subscribed so that we can see you next time.